In this video I'm going to start cutting my plywood and probably assemble it too. This is my plywood marine grade for Douglas fir plywood and it's an AB. It's been a little bit difficult to figure out which one is the A side, but I can see that possibly this side is the smoother one. When I touch it with my hand I can feel both sides the same smoothness, so it's a little bit more difficult like I said, but just by looking at it I can see there's some damage on the underneath, possibly even rougher on certain sections. So I decided this is the B side, this is the A side on the top. That's what I'm going to go with. Before I cut my actual plywood, I have this half-inch, I think, birch plywood that I'm going to use, make a jig, basically a guiding jig for the circular saw, because when I cut 8 feet long and I want it to be straight, it's not possible to do it with hand. So I stuck a piece of poplar here, glued it in about half an hour ago, and I'm going to do a cut all the way down with my circular saw to make the guiding jig. So here's my finished jig, the cut that I made. So whenever I have something to cut that is long, 8 feet long cut, I'm going to use this as a guide. All I have to do is align this edge over here with the line of the cut on the plywood. Take my saw, put it on top here, and the blade is automatically aligned to the edge. So I'm just going to run the saw like this on the top of my jig to make the final cut on the plywood. So I lay my plywood down on a few 2x4s like this. I have a bunch in between in there too. And I'm ready to mark the cuts. I have the printout for my cut list optimizer here for the 2 sheets. I'm going to pick one and I'm going to start marking it with pencils. Basically I'm going to take I know there's a 1 inch difference, so I'm going to add half an inch, and that's what I'm going to cut. So instead of 22 inches from the edge, I'm going to cut at 22.5 inches. The one thing is that the way I laid the plywood is the bad side up and the good side is underneath, because apparently the way to cut it is to cut the blade should be on the bad side. So since I'm going to be moving the circular saw on the top using my jig, I have the bad side up and the good side is under. If this was on a table saw, the table saw blade is under, so the bad side will be down and the good side will be up. But since I'm doing a circular saw, like I said, the bad side is up here. So here's my dimensions. I need 22 inches across the length of the plywood. That's going to be my first cut, and then 4 inches here and 18 inches here, and that's the length of my plywood. So I'm going to cut this line at 22.5 because I had that 1 inch gap. That's going to be my line that I drew over here, and 5 inches later I have another line which corresponds to this 4 inches, because I have half inch on each side. And then after that line I have the 18 inches, so 19 including the over edge, half inch on each side. So that's my line. So I'm going to make these 3 cuts first. Once I'm done with this, then I'm going to go for the horizontal cuts. So these are all my cut pieces from just one plywood that I finished. I'm going to move on to the next plywood. The one important thing I did is, before even I moved the pieces out of place, I named it, I put a tape on it and gave the same name that was on my cut list convention, so I know what piece is this, and I also know, because of the existence of tape, that this is the bad side. So here's my finished coarse cuts, that means rough cuts, for every piece in the cabinet. This is the whole stack from the 2 plywood, and this is my waste, so to speak. I might reuse this if I make any mistakes over here. So one thing I did different is that for these smaller pieces in the 2nd plywood, when I cut the whole thing off first and then I moved it onto my table saw to quickly rip cuts this. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it just made sense to move it to the table saw. Sometimes I would move it to my miter saw to cut smaller cuts like this. Because I didn't want to, it's more efficient to move it to the saws than cutting it by hand, each one of them. And that's it. This finishes the phase 1, so to speak, of this video. I'm going to move on to phase 2, which is basically the opposite of what we did. Now we're going to do fine cutting. Basically, take all these pieces in, move it to the table saw and the cross cut, and to make perfect cuts and perfect measurements as needed for the cabinet. Now for phase 3, like I said before, I'm going to cut all my lumber into actual dimensions. That is the actual dimensions ready for assembly. In phase 1, all I did was rough cuts. So in order to get the actual dimensions, I have to do 2 things. First, I have to do all the rip cuts together. Then I'm going to do all the cross cuts together. So in order to do the rip cuts, I'm going to use my table saw. In order to do the cross cuts, I'm going to use my cross cut sled that I will show later. Now, to do the rip cuts, I'm going to follow a procedure called ABA. ABA is sort of a verb that is used basically to say that I want to make 2 sides parallel. So for example, if I want an 8-inch parallel rip cut all the way 8-inch from top, all the way 8-inch, perfectly 8-inch on the bottom, that's called ABA. That means I'm making 2 sides, this side and this side, exactly parallel 8 inches apart. Now, in order to do that, what I'm going to do is do an ABA cut, which basically means that I'm going to do 3 cuts. First, I'm going to do this A, that means I'm going to pass it and make a cut on one side, the A side. Then I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to make another pass, a second pass on the B side. Then I'm going to turn it around for the 3rd time and I'm going to make a 3rd pass again on the A side. So that's what ABA means. And every time I do a pass, I reduce my scale. That means that when I start with 8, let's say I have 8.5 inches here, but I want an 8-inch parallel. So what I'll do is start with, if I have 8.5 inches, the first cut I will do at 8 inches and let's say 6/16. Then I reduce my scale for the second cut and I do 8 inches and 3/16 on the B side. Now I reduce my scale again and I do 8 inches. That is my final cut, again the A side. That's my 3rd cut, is my final cut. So what's happening in ABA, if you have deduced by now, that what we are doing is when doing one cut and using that cut as a support for the fence, then I turn it around and do the next cut. Then I do the 3rd cut again. I use the other side as a fence, as a support to the fence to do my 3rd cut. So every time I do a cut, I get a perfect cut and a perfect support for the fence 3 times, ABA. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this as an example here and show the results. So my first pass is going to be on the A side on the blade, and I adjusted the scale to about 8 inches and let's say 6/16, about 6/16. Now I'm going to adjust the scale back to about 8 inches and 3/16. It doesn't matter where, as long as it's more than the thickness of the blade. I'm going to take my wood that I got, turn it around to the B side, and now make a pass. I'm going to take my wood and turn it around again, back on the A side, use that against the fence, and adjust the scale to my final required dimension, which is 8 inches. There you go. That's my final cut on the A side again. So here's my final cut. Supposed to be exactly 8 inches, like you see, and it will be exactly 8 inches parallel all the way from top to bottom. This is my final dimension. So I'm going to do this for all the pieces that I have, and this is the reason, main reason why I kept that 1 inch gap when I did the rough cuts, because I should be able to do the ABA properly and have enough space to do the ABA to get to my final dimension. Just a side comment, this is technically not a rib cut because I'm cutting perpendicular to the grain. When I say rib cuts, the grain will be parallel to the, parallel to the braid. So this is just for an example. So now I'm going to ABA all my ABA rib cut, all my stack. I have some stack here and I transfer some stack over here. What I'm going to do is do all these similar width together. I have all these stack that has to be 4 inches wide. So I'm going to do all these together. So I'm going to set it to, it's probably about 4.5 to 5 inches. I'm going to set it to about 4 and 3/16, or sorry, 4 and half or 4 and 6/16 in the first step. Do all of these together. Then I transfer my measurement to 4 and 3/16, and then repeat on the other side, on the B side, all of these together. And then finally, I'll set my measurement to 4 inches and do all of these together. That I think is the most efficient way to do this. And that's the reason when I designed the cabinet, I tried to keep this width as similar as possible for most of the parts, as much as possible, so that I can do this all together instead of doing it one by one in different measurements. So I have all these 4 inches together here. I have all these 2 inches together here, and then there's some 22 inches together, possibly a couple of 18 inches together. So I'll do all these similar ones together, like I explained. I finished all the rib cuts now. I'm going to move on to make all my cross cuts with my cross cut sled. The reason we need this cross cut sled is because without this sled, it's going to be very hard to make this kind of cut, because without this sled, if I use the fence of the table saw, I might move the wood like this and it's not going to be a perpendicular cut. And it's much safer also to use a cross cut sled. I have a separate video on how I made this cross cut sled, already posted in the past. So all I do is put the crosscut sled on. It slides like this on top. This is my measurement stop block that moves left and right to adjust the measurement. A couple of adjustments I did is made sure that the blade is a little bit higher than the thickness of the plywood. I also raised the blade and made sure that it's perpendicular. I mean, it should be, but I made sure it's perpendicular. And that is it. I'm ready to make the cuts. Now in this cuts, I don't have to do any kind of ABA because I've already done the rib cut ABA on these two sides, and because of the fact that I already know that my fence of the crosscut sled is exactly perpendicular to the cut of the blade, I put this side, the ABA side, flush to the fence, and any cut I make is by default going to be, or implicitly going to be, perpendicular to this. So all I'm going to do is cut a little bit on each side of the cross cut to make the length that I need, to build the length that I need. So for example, if I need, let's say 16.5, I'm going to cut maybe 17 on one side, turn the wood around and do 16.5 or a second. So just to make sure that I have nice cuts on both sides, perpendicular cuts on both sides. That's it. I'm going to move ahead and do all the cross cuts now. Before I start cutting, one thing to note is that I'm using the same philosophy as I did in the rib cuts. That means I am taking all these similarly dimensioned or similarly with cross cuts. For example, these 16.5 over here, the tops, the toe kicks, the back top, as well as the base over here 16.5. I'm going to group them all together like this and this, that I know that I need one dimension. So I'll not disturb my stop block to make sure that I get as precise cuts as possible for all the 16.5 together. Once I'm done with all the 16.5s, then I'm going to move on to the other cross cuts, like for example these 28, 4 of them, and cut them all together. And that's how I'm going to move on one dimension at a time until I finish all of them. So here's my finished set of wood cut to the exact dimensions. Now I'm going to move on to phase 3 of cuts, which is not as difficult as phase 2. I'm going to do all the toe kicks necessary and also the rabbets for the back top so I can hold the half-inch panel. So I'm going to start the toe kicks first. In order to do the toe kicks, I'm going to have to make sure that I have the right side facing. So I have the face of the cabinet, that is the good side. I want it on the inside of the cabinet. So these are my two sides. And the bad side is marked over here and on the here. It's easy to make a mistake at this point and make a toe kick that wouldn't align. So I'm going to make a toe kick on this side over here, and I'm going to make one over here. That's how I'm going to align all the sides properly before cutting the toe kicks. I'm going to use my T-bar to mark 2 inches all the way. Align my blade to the line. Put my fence in. And then cut. These are all my toe kicks finished. I'm going to move on to make my rabbet for all the back tops. All the back tops are marked with BT. So I took all the BT and set up my router bit, the 3/4 inch straight bit. And I'm using the half-inch panel that I'm going to be actually using to cover the back. I use that height as a guide to make sure my top edge tip of the blade is aligned with the top surface of the half-inch panel. Once I'm done with that, I also marked my 3/4 inch line using my T-bar, and that's the line up to which I'm going to make the rabbet, and it's going to be 3/4 inch wide, and the depth will be the same depth as the half-inch panel that I already set up. So I'm going to route all of these and make this rabbet for all the back tops on the bottom. I have 4 of these for the 4 cabinets. So here's all my cut wood to exact dimensions that I need. Next step is to edge band and sand and then assemble it. So just to summarize, this whole cutting process, we started with phase 1. We took the whole 4x8 sheet and cut into rough dimensions. It doesn't have to be exact, but we kept 1 inch sort of gap between 2 materials. The second phase was to cut into exact dimensions using the table saw and the crosscut sled, where we did the process called ABA for rib cuts and then use that parallel size to do proper crosscuts on the crosscut sled. And the third phase was to do any sort of special cuts like these toe kick area over here and my rabbet to put the back panel in. So that's it. That's the summary. Thanks for watching.